everybody. So I am very excited to be here talking to you about personal knowledge graphs and what I actually mean by that, because there's a few different definitions of that floating around. So today we're going to be walking through that and why I think this is something that is going to be coming up more and more often in industry, and how if you are working in graph or if you're thinking about graph, this might be a good place for you to start. If you're already doing graph, this is something that you could pivot into. So just as a background for me, I have my YouTube channel that I teach all about data and knowledge graph topics. So if you want to go and check that out, you can learn more about all of this over there. All right, so with that, let us get started. So let's look at what is the actual problem. So this is from the customer perspective. So as a consumer, I know all of my interactions generate some kind of data. Most people know that now because they get that little pop-up that says cookies. They don't know what a cookie is, but they know that it has something to do with tracking their data. People also have caught on that these are being used on all kinds of recommendations across Facebook, Google, Spotify, Amazon. All of those are using some form of inferencing to understand what the end user is interested in. And this is to help the user. And the thing is about that is sometimes it can get a little tricky to understand how well we in the industry are providing those answers. And that's because we have a lot of those assertions that we have to make. When we are talking about a typical graph, these are inferences, or you can do network analysis, shortest path, a lot of different types of algorithms to help you understand what kind of data is coming from your end user and looking at the behavior. The thing is, we don't actually ask the customer. We don't actually ask the end user. And that's actually where personal knowledge graph comes in, where a big tenet of that is understanding how the user's data plays into your data and how the data that the user can maybe provide to you can input into what you're doing. So this is where I wish I could trust those assumptions as an end user. And additional complications to this are a lot of users are not sharing their data as much as they used to. This actually helps with a little bit of that, because if you give some of that transparency and you give the customer back some of the autonomy of what happens with their data, and they can actually see some of that, that is where you gain some of that trust back, and users are more likely to trust you with some of their data if they kind of know what you're doing with it and they can see some of that in action. So some potential solutions from the field. So you might have noticed this. Google has started to add transparency and feedback to their search results. So you can see this here in my little screenshot. This is something that is kind of hidden at this point. It is just kind of rolling out and being tried. But this is an example of where that trust and transparency in data is coming from. Wayfair is also adding things like digital home data to make better recommendations, where the end user can actually say, hey, here is the things that I'm interested in for my home, and give me recommendations based on that. So they can kind of have their own folder of interests. Healthcare, this is the electronic health records. These are now starting to be presented to the end user, so the end user can give some of that feedback. And that's really what this personal knowledge graph is focused on. And then academic research papers. This is another one that's near and dear to my heart. This is connected papers here in the example, where you can go in and update, is this really the paper that you wrote? Is this really the same Ashleigh faith? Making sure that you can give some of that feedback. So there are 3 different solution types to personal knowledge graph today. And this is where we get into, this is an evolving space where there are many different definitions. So the first one is maintained and populated by the individual. So these would be things like the personal note taker kind of things. The next is personal, but maintained and populated by a company. And so that would be like a customer 360 or something that the customer doesn't actually get to see or interact with. It's the stuff behind the scenes. Then there's the third type that is, I would say, solid-like. If you know what solid is, it's sort of like that, but more user-focused. I have some beefs with solid and how it's not really helpful to a everyday user that doesn't understand graph. So this third is kind of aiming at some of the personalization, having that ownership, the end user having the ownership of some of the data, but kind of marrying it with these first two, where the customer can actually help curate some of the data that is being used in their day-to-day interactions, and it's inputted into the knowledge graphs that you already have at your institution or your company or what have you. So some of these things don't really exist yet. And that's why we wanted to have this conversation, because I truly think this is something that's going to be coming more to the forefront, because a lot of companies already have knowledge graphs about people, whether they know the individual or not. It's just the user behavior. But we're still not giving great recommendations. Everybody's starting to run after that personalization. This is a way to make sure that we do it ethically, responsibly, and also making sure that the end user, who is getting a lot smarter about their data, has some interaction with it, and they can see and interact with what you are presenting to them to help make it things better, because they want better recommendations and we want to have better interactions with people. So here are some of those examples of the personal knowledge graph that is focused on your individual nodes. So you can see there's a ton of these coming out. So this is the one that people are most associated with when they talk about PKGs. You can also see lab folder, and those types of things are kind of in the same vein, where you can make notes and you can connect your research all together, sort of like a mind map. It's not really knowledge graph behind the scenes for all of these. Some of them there are, but not all of them. But it's taking the user, and that's all it is, right? I can make my own knowledge graph for me, and that's it. And that's all, that's where it stops. The next is maintained and populated by a company. So you can see here, like LinkedIn has an entire network of your people and who you are connected with and the companies you're connected with and who you follow and all of those things. So name your organization, right? Like Spotify has these. Anybody that has a login of some sort has some kind of graph in some form around you as an individual, but the individual usually doesn't have a lot of interaction with it. Now we get into those PKGs that are getting a little bit closer to what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, how you can use graph and maybe retrofit the graph you have to do some of these things. So here you can see a lot of IoT applications are looking at this, where it's looking at a specific thing in the universe of other things. It's flipping the script a little bit on you're not creating a graph as a giant graph and figuring out where the input is in that graph. What you're instead doing is you are saying, here's the input, me, or an IoT device, right? And what is the network that I connect out to? And that's the shift in thinking for these. And the way you do that, right, is taking the mega graph that you have or that you're trying to develop and focusing on the individual and seeing what parts of that graph connect to that person. That's how you kind of retrofit a graph that you already have to do this. And I've already heard a few presentations talking about the metaverse. This is incredibly useful for the metaverse or metaverses or whichever one you're talking about. Basically, the shared universes and experience. That's what the metaverse really is. That's where this can actually start to pop up too, right? So if I'm a user and I am used to, playing around in Red Dead Redemption. Yes, I joined that presentation earlier today. And I have my own interactions from that game. But now I want to pop over to a different game, maybe by the same publisher. But I want to take some of my experiences and things that I like and kind of retrofit them into whatever that other game knows about me. That's kind of what we're talking about here as well. So what is the status today? So in today's world, the customer has their own data, right? That's from the number one PKG type. The company has a PKG and it is related to the customer. or they can create one around the customer if the customer is a brand new interaction. The customer then can maybe request their data, right? Because we have some laws and regulations around this today, and that's like GDPR and some of the other privacy laws that are going on out there. So you can actually ask for your data now. That's actually a really important piece to this presentation is if I had to guess where this is going to go in the next few years, the reason I'm saying it's going to be maybe the next big thing is because of this. People are getting so much more traction from their data. They are starting to educate themselves on their data. And you might say, well, you know, my typical grandma or niece that's maybe 5 years old, that's always my benchmark, by the way. Do they actually know about their data? Do they actually understand? You know, probably not, but they are getting more exposure to this, and that's only going to keep growing. And that's where this really comes in is, okay, now I can own my data. I can download my data. I can see what happens with my data. And I know people are selling my data or using my data for things. How can we create better transparency with your organization so that that user feels more comfortable with what you're doing with that data and they can contribute to it? That's actually getting excitement from the end user. I have done this before where I have actually seen end users seeing their graph on the screen for the very first time. And I'm telling you, it was the most beautiful thing. Their eyeballs just like lit up like, oh, whoa, I feel like Tony Stark. That was an actual quote. I'm like, oh, great. I'm making people feel like Tony Stark. That's a good compliment for graph. So if we're talking about, you know, better graph adoption, this might be a way to help with that. Now, do we show them the full graph? Do we give away the store? Absolutely not. But we can show, because human interactions with each other and with other things takes on this same kind of framework where I know I'm related to my sister because we are related, right? I understand that from a human perspective. So simplifying the types of graph interactions that we have is going to be imperative to this. But I think that's where property graph really helps because we can raise it up to that higher meta model for what we're talking about here. Now, the thing with the graph of today is the main PKG model is a top-down approach, right? So you have your mega graph, and then you have the individual that is having an interaction that kind of connects up into that graph somehow. But you're really still looking at the mega graph from an overall perspective. The customer experience, even if it's personalized, is pulled from that universal graph. And then the company assumes things based on that user's interaction and that mega graph. So it's really just that read-only kind of perspective. And you can see here the dotted lines is where we're kind of trying to figure out, is this accurate? Is this true? Well, let's look at tomorrow, right? So it's a bring your own data model. Bring your own data to the model, I should say. And this is where you can see how the lines are no longer dotted. And that is because that data is being supported either through triangulation, meaning the customer perhaps comes with some of their own data, right? Because they can at least today download some of their data, right? And is there a mechanism to have an end user that's not a graph person do this today? No, there isn't. Could there be? Yes. And I keep pushing for it, by the way. So if any of you are working on that, please let me know. I'm very interested. But if the user is coming in with some of their own data and they can see what data you're providing, right? It creates this beautiful bridge where everyone wins. This is a really powerful thing where users are going to be able to see how their data is being used and be able to correct it when it gets it wrong, right? So the interface for the customer to give feedback, it can be just a simple GUI, right? It doesn't have to be anything complicated. PKG models need to be interoperable, right? Because we're talking about sharing of data. That's where, you know, property graphs don't all have a great standard, but I know Neo4j is working on some of those things. So keep at it, folks. I really hope that goes forward soon. But even if you have something simplistic like a CSV kind of input, that's, you know, start simple before people get too crazy with, you know, the interfaces they're designing on this. But this model is looking at it from a bi-directional, right? It's a way of creating a bridge between the two graphs, the personal, my graph that I created or that I know from my data, and your graph, big company that's trying to probably sell me something or make my experience better. It's a bridge between those two things. And so it's really banking on the fact that the individual is now a first-class citizen in what we're trying to do. So looking at this from a side-by-side comparison, you can see the differences. Company graph versus a customer who has created their graph and seeing how they come together. And you can see where those dotted lines are now more solid because we have corrected the assumptions that were being made and potentially even adding more context. So you can see that I was a volunteer maybe at a company, and that's why I know some of these other people, not necessarily because we work together or some other mysterious connection that isn't defined. So how do you actually do this, right? So the models, the data exchanges, and more. So a lot of principles are already in place to make this work correctly. So some of the big challenges, though, are some kind of canonical, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a global wide interaction with all graphs. I don't think that's ever going to get a lot of traction, but we can learn from the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things had to, I was involved in some of these standards meetings where all the big, players were in a room, a lot of them competitors, and they said, okay, let's talk about our cards. What are we all willing to share? Because we got to make this thing work, right? That moment needs to happen for the personal knowledge graph stuff to actually get off the ground. I think if there's enough incentive, and I think there will be, it's going to happen. And that facilitation is already ongoing, I think, behind the scenes in a lot of subcategories of graph. Data exchange with APIs, we're already very familiar with that. That's what Graph really does well. Basic customer-facing GUIs, again, that's not, the actual interface to this is not very difficult. It wouldn't be that much different than looking at a social network, for instance. Data share contracts, I've heard so much about that recently, and that's where in that, meeting of the minds, everyone agrees, here's the type of data that we can share. Because one thing you got to remember is it's not necessarily the data that's proprietary all the time. Like a cat is a cat, no matter where you're looking at. The color blue is the color blue, no matter where you're at. It's what you're doing with the data that actually matters. So some of these data share contracts are going to have some of that worked out. Then transparency on the makers on which data point comes from where. That triangulation and understanding where the dependencies came from, that's going to be really important to personal knowledge graph. And then, of course, recommendation, personalization, and then results. Having a feedback loop, just like we saw with the Google example, where you can now go in and look at your search results and say, nope, I don't like this. Nope, you got it wrong here. That kind of interaction is going to become more and more apparent because people want to have a say in what they get. And it's going to make their experience better. That's, everyone is need to be customer focused here because the customer, the end user, is the one who's going to benefit from this too. All right, so what is the potential solution? And I promise this is one of the last slides. So as a consumer, right, the first two are the same as when we saw in the beginning. But now with a personal knowledge graph, here's what's different. When the suggestion isn't right, when it's a dumb suggestion, I can fix it. I can make sure that you never send that to me again because it's a dumb recommendation and I don't want to see it anymore. It's good for me. It's good for you. I get better results. I don't waste my time. And it sparks joy because now I feel like I have a say in it as a user. And that's really important. Next is I have a way of providing information to get help when I need it, how I need it, and for the exact situation I'm in, right? So think about it from a perspective of a student. A student eventually graduates. So their interactions and the things that they're interacting with when they're a student might be different than when they graduate. Knowing when that happens, you might be able to figure out when that happens. or a customer that is now a parent. Oh, that's a big difference. Now their patterns are going to be different. So allowing the end user to say, hey, I'm doing this thing now. Let me get rid of those old, maybe single person recommendations, whatever those might be, and now give me the married person kind of persona stuff. That would be helpful to me. And then here's some real facts on this. Having done this in my past lives a few times, so adding these kind of interactions, it actually gives you more trust in the recommendations. Trust in the study that I did was going from a 65% to an 81% trustworthiness score. And then because of that higher transparency, the search results were more engaging. And so you can see here, we went from a 5-minute average duration of active user doing things to 15 minutes. Now, for those of you that want somebody to get in, get out, get what they want, you have to use your own metrics for this. In the situation I was looking at, it was researcher based. So the more research a person was doing, the better it was. So going from 5 minutes to 15-minute duration was actually a good thing for us. And a big reason for this is the end user felt like they were heard. We were actually giving them a way to nominate their information, and they didn't feel like they were just another number in the system. Again, we also made sure that we were very transparent on what was being used. If the end user was bringing in data, we made sure to specify what that was going to be used for, how it was not going to be shared with anybody else. Those sharing contracts is incredibly important in all of this. All right, so going through all of that pretty quickly, there is a lot to unpack with this, but what I want you to take away from this presentation is, first, having your end user as a first-class citizen and having them have some kind of feedback loop in what you're actually doing is a very big and important thing for all of us to start to work towards. The second thing is knowledge graphs are a big part of this. We already have a lot of these big graphs. We already have a lot of customer 360s and fraud detection and all of these other things that are out there. But now swapping it a little bit so that an end user can come in and say, okay, how can I take that graph and wrap it around me like a big warm blanket, right? Like that's the analogy I want you to walk away from this, because it makes you feel good. It makes the end user feel like they are more heard and they really get what you're trying to do with their data, and they feel like they have a contribution to that. And that's why I think it's going to be the next big thing in search, because everybody wants better search results, especially with the amount of data that we have today. All right, so if you want to go and check me out, here's my LinkedIn and my YouTube. And with that, I am going to stop and hopefully switch over and see some questions. We'll see. My mouse fell asleep. There we go. Okay. Wow, there's a lot of questions, I think. All right, so where would... Okay, I'm trying to find the first question. Let's see. It's kind of difficult because everybody, all the chat kind of runs together in here. Okay, let's see here. Give me a second. And I'm super boring right now while I'm reading through things, so apologies for that. All right. Okay, here we go. Question is, why countries like EU and even the US, these things are not easy to implement in practice? What's your recommendation? Organizations have data and can easily be modeled as a KG or a PKG, but issue are policies. Yes. So this is where you have to really, the data privacy policies are very different for not just country, but, in the US, at least state and even, region. So you have to be very aware of those things. But the way that I have been thinking about this, and the way that I put this into practice in my past life, is if you are working with the individual and the individual can, like a good example is connected papers, right? That's not the individual's personal data. It's a lot of stuff that's already out and on the open web. So I would recommend starting with the data that is not connected to the individual quite yet. And I would look at when you have that piece of the graph that the user can see, for instance, what citations do I have for my paper, or my social media network. That is a little bit easier to work with at first until you start to understand what your real use case is to make those data sharing contracts. That is where you're going to really want, your legal team and everybody else to look at it to make sure that you understand what you're doing. And the GDPR stuff is actually working in your favor there, because there's a lot of very explicit guidelines on that one. That's obviously not everybody in the US following that, but it's a good place to start and reference. All right, so looking at Jeff's comment here, I would love for user customer participants to control their profile. The technology is present, the incentives and the money are not. Yes. Oh, of course. There's a lot of stuff out there that's open right now that's looking at what does a personal knowledge graph look like. I know that there's some working groups and some standards that are ongoing. I know that there are a lot of universities that are looking at this. How do you put this into place at your workforce, though, and to get your workplace, I should say, and to get the money to back it? I think if you're working in anything that deals with personalization and recommendations, that's probably the best place for you to start, because if you get better recommendations, it's more transactions usually, and that usually gives you the data you need to get a sign off. That's my experience, at least. Trade secrets. Yeah, you want to make sure you don't give away the trade secrets when you are putting a personal knowledge graph in place. That's where you do have to go and have that sharing contract. Again, that's one of the more important pieces to this, is identify what is okay to share and making sure that, it applies to all the data privacy laws. And, it doesn't have to be anything too outrageous at first, right? We're just trying to help people understand why are they getting the search results that they are, and what data can they provide to get better results. So you don't necessarily have to do that. I came in expecting Obsidian and all of that. Yeah, I mean, that's a part of it. The individual graphs, that's where that kind of comes in. But this is making it more usable, I think, for an end company to have a better transaction with their end user. So it's not just Obsidian based. Let's see, a lot from Jeff. So Jeff, I'm going to have to skip through some of yours though. Apologies for coughing in your ear. Have to be a standard communication language. Yeah. So that's the data sharing contract. So like schema.org, right? Super beneficial. A lot of people are adopting it, and it's because there's an incentive. You want to get picked up by the search engines. When I'm talking about IoT, they had to create not necessarily a common schema. You can even go with simplified schema, meaning like CSVs. If, apologies, I've been talking too much today. If you want to go in that direction. But what I would say is, if you are looking at the knowledge share, right, it doesn't have to be in any particular schema. You can just do, like I said, CSV, simple JSON file, as long as you can put it into something that is easily parsable, right? then you're on the right track. This is also going to help with your end user situation too. So if you want your end user to be able to come in and have some of their own data, if they can't download their data, or they want to just be able to, give you some data to go off of, most people know how to create an Excel file, right? So giving them a template, right, is even a good way, no or low code way of doing this. So yes, eventually we do want to get to a common kind of canonical schema, but until that meeting of the minds happens, it's going to be kind of tough. But there are other shareable kind of frameworks that we can use. All right. Graph database should be able to be created. That is an ISO. Yeah. Yes. I would love if there was an ISO communications language for this. If anybody's interested, I sign up for that one. UI UX use cases for this must be easily enough supported by 80%. Yep. So creating a UI for this, I think that there were a few attempts earlier this year where people were just doing some POCs. That was pretty cool to see. It's really fun to put this out as a challenge for, some kind of Kaggle, right? So putting that together. Where else have I seen this? Some people have done it as like a hackathon kind of thing, where a simple UI backed by something like Neo4j, which is great because there's a healthy free tier that you can like play around with and see what's going to work. That I think is going to be the most helpful in this situation, and having your use case in mind, right? So going into this, I've had a lot of people ask, well, there's a lot of privacy things that you could put into a personal graph. If I put my personal information in, that's where some data literacy has to happen too, right? So that would be making sure that there is a node that means your password. It isn't your password, and making sure that the end users are aware of that. So they're not putting in data that would be compromising. Making sure that there are standards around that. Data literacy, I think, is going to be also important to this. Bill says, very interesting. Thank you, Bill. This tool could be used for translation by individual people and companies where they have their own instance. Yes, absolutely. That's a part of this. And I was asked in a different presentation about this. How are all these external companies going to agree to share their data? Well, I mean, that's where the individual gets to choose which of them they get their data from. So in this case, it's the user nominating to get their data and be able to take that around with them. That's the whole principle behind like the solid kind of personal knowledge graph. And I do believe, again, I keep going back to the IoT situation because it worked. It happened where, different big companies that had some of this data had to agree which pieces of those data, of their data is going to get shared. Same thing here, where if you are looking at when other companies are going to be allowing the interchange of information, it's when they all have the incentive to do so. IoT was a good example. The metaverse or digital twins might be another that's coming out. Thank you, Miss Faith. It's Dr. Faith, by the way. No, it is, but I don't go by that. It's okay. This kind of issue has been in discussion for a lot of time. Yep. Secure way via APIs. Yep. We are not yet there. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that we're maybe not ready for it yet. I don't think it's that the technology isn't there. I think the technology is there. I think that there have been so many organizations trying to catch up on the personalization train that they are trying to figure it all out themselves. And that's why I love personal knowledge graphs in this context, because it takes some of the guesswork out. It's like I'm sitting in on listening to all of these big companies talk about, oh, personalization. We have to figure this out and that out. And I'm like, or I could just ask, right? Have we tried asking? I know some of us have, by the way. And I know a lot have noticed that users don't want to nominate data. a big part of that is the transparency issue. They don't want to give data because they don't know what you're going to do with it. And because there's a lot of things in the news where, personal data is not being used wisely or ethically, we have to be very transparent about how we are using it and what it's being used for. All right. And it looks like Trevor is coming back on. So I don't know if I'm going to get through all the questions.
You can always go back into the chat and answer them through there if you have the time to. Otherwise, they've got your different forms of communication to reach out to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. Again, I teach a lot. I actually have a few videos on my channel all about this in more detail, how you can use some of this same technology for data migration and other things like that. So just putting that out there as well.